lab tech, over here.
Two murders are linked by unusual bullets, but linking them to the killers seems like a shot in the dark. A woman points the finger of blame at her killers, but catching them depends on a forensic technique that hasn't been invented yet. When detectives on the trail of cattle rustlers uncover what looks like serial murder, they call on forensics to help them round up their suspects. They say that a burden shared is a burden halved, but when partners team up for murder, the weight of their crime can drag them both down. The burden of proof is on forensics to capture partners in crime. November 19th, 1989, around 11:30 p.m., on the mean streets of Trenton, New Jersey, a passerby discovered a brutal murder. The victim was 38-year-old Francis C. Bodner, a driver for Golden Cabs.
All right, lab tech, over here, please. Lab tech.
Officers at the scene examined the victim's body and combed the taxi for clues. Along with the slugs, they recovered a small metal disc with a raised edge, almost like a miniature bottle cap. It was a puzzling find. Detective Lieutenant Michael Salvatore felt it held the key to solving this crime.
Right, come on, tell me about that case from last night.
Because no one had ever seen that type of bullet before, that there was a possibility that the bullet had been created by an enthusiast, someone who loads their own bullets at home.
Hey, gentlemen.
If that were true, the bullets would be almost impossible to trace. But Salvatore hadn't seen the last of them. Just 4 hours later, he was called to another murder scene. A second taxicab driver was shot dead. Willie Rogers, age 33, had been discovered in the taxi he drove for the Diamond Cab Company.
What do we got, guys?
Again, investigators recovered the same odd metal disc, along with a spent bullet.
There she is. That's what we've been looking
And in both cases, witnesses reported seeing 3 black men in the taxi prior to the murder. The evidence technicians soon produced another clue, a fingerprint lifted from the first taxi's front passenger side door. The Trenton Police Department's evidence lab transmitted the print to the National Fingerprint Database, a clearinghouse for fingerprint evidence from around the country. It would take some time before the results came back. And there was no guarantee the print on the cab belonged to the killer. The Mercer County medical examiner performed the autopsies later that day. Bodner and Rogers were both killed by a single shot to the back of the head, execution style. The executioners left behind little besides the unusual bullets. To solve the execution-style murders, Trenton police had to rely on ballistic evidence taken from the crime scene. It's all they had. By 11 o'clock on the morning the drivers were killed, Trenton police had delivered the bullets to the New Jersey State Police Lab's Captain Mike Lysinger. The bullets perplexed him as much as they did Detective Salvatore, and Lysinger had been a ballistics expert for more than 20 years. His reference books showed that the little metal cap was called a gas check.
The gas check is very unusual because you never see this in commercial ammunition. This was the first time we have ever encountered a gas check as long as I've been in ballistics. This was something unique to us.
A gas check is placed on the base of the bullet to keep it from melting and clogging the gun barrel with lead. Many people who make their own bullets use gas checks. But Lysinger could tell these bullets were commercially manufactured, though no American company made them. Now, he had to determine what sort of gun fired them. Using the lab's stereo microscope, he identified the pattern of alternating grooves and the spaces between the grooves, or lands, left on the bullets as they sped through the gun barrel. These lands and grooves are a gun's class characteristics, and ballistics experts can use them to identify the type of weapon most likely to have left them on a bullet. Lysinger determined that the Trenton gas check bullets had a pattern of 5 lands and grooves with a twist to the right. He told Salvatore to look for a Taurus revolver, a Ruger revolver, or a Smith & Wesson. All of these were in common use among Trenton criminals. Any one of thousands of weapons could have left its mark on the bullets. Investigators didn't even know where to start looking. Before long, however, they got their first lead. In the early morning of November 27th, an anonymous caller told Trenton police that 2 of the gunmen were twins named Ron and John Allen. Later that same day, John Allen was picked up for smashing car windows during a street fight. Investigators had him brought up for an interview. John Allen said he had been with his twin Ron and their friend all evening the night the cabbies were killed. They had hung out at a couple of clubs until 3 a.m. Salvatore wasn't convinced, but without physical evidence tying John Allen to the killings, he had nothing. When John Allen's prints didn't match the one pulled from the taxi, detectives wondered about his brother. They pulled Ron Allen's prints from a previous arrest record. Trenton police compared Ron Allen's file print against the one left on the taxi. The point-by-point comparison was a match. Ron Allen had been in the murdered man's vehicle. That wasn't enough to prove he was the murderer. Taxis see dozens of fares each day, but the match told investigators they were on the right track. Police learned that the Allen brothers were Trenton locals who became involved with a rough and dangerous gang called the New York Boys. Turf was at a premium in the Big Apple, so the gangs there started colonizing New Jersey. The Allens were recruited.
I mean, Chief Williams knew all.
Detectives continued to interview friends and enemies of the Allen brothers, hoping to poke holes in their alibi, hoping for anything they could use.
On the street, just about everybody knew what was going on, but unfortunately, in a lot of the homicide cases I've worked on, people are very reluctant to come forward and give that information up.
The information they gathered continued to implicate the Allen brothers, but stopped short of being enough to arrest them. Then, on the evening of December 20th, 1989, one courageous eyewitness stepped forward. When police assured him that he'd be safe, he agreed to talk. He told police that he was parked directly behind the first victim's taxi during the crime. He saw Bodner shot from behind and heard the window shatter. Then he drove past the cab, fast, and saw 3 men going through Bodner's pockets. He identified Ron and John Allen as 2 of the 3 men he had seen in the cab that night. The dragnet was closing in on the Allen brothers, but a single fingerprint and a rushed eyewitness account might not be strong enough to win the maximum sentence for these alleged killers.
Second gentleman from.
Detectives still needed to find a way to use the killer's ammunition against them.
This is what I'm talking about right here.
The investigation into the gang-style murder of 2 Trenton taxi drivers was making slow progress. Police had a witness who could place the Allen brothers at the scene of one driver's murder. Now they had to place a gun in their hands. They got help from a police informant.
But what do you got for me? Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. You interested?
He told police that the Allens had tried to sell him guns and ammunition several weeks back, and that the guns had 2 bodies on them, 2 murders.
Yo, let me think about that. Yo, I just
He didn't buy them.
All right. Think about it, all right? Get back to it.
To prove the Allens' involvement, Detective Salvatore needed those guns. He sent the informant out to get them. The informant risked his life to do so.
On vacation today? Within 2 days, we received a phone call from the informant, and he had the weapons.
He turned over the 2 revolvers and a fistful of bullets that he had just purchased from the Allens.
Recently, our cabbies. We also have.
Salvatore sent the guns to the ballistics lab to compare with the slugs recovered from the taxis.
He's the same class character.
Both guns had 5 lands and grooves with a right-hand twist. Both could have fired the bullets found at the crime scenes. Another test would determine if one of them actually had. The guns were test-fired. The marks on the test-fired slugs from one of the guns matched the fatal slugs. Investigators had found the weapon they were looking for, the gun that killed Francis Bodner and Willie Rogers. Police obtained the warrants they needed to arrest the Allens. Officers swarmed over the places where they usually hung out. They found John Allen and brought him in. Ron Allen called Detective Salvatore a few hours later, asking about his twin. Detectives had the call traced.
While I was talking to Ron on the phone, we had a couple teams out here in West Trenton, a couple detective teams poised in various locations out here because we knew this is where they frequented and where he probably was. And as soon as we got the information from the Bell operator, we fed that information to our units on the street, and they came here and they forced their way into the house and arrested Ron Allen, who was still on the phone with me at the time of the arrest.
Tell me your story one more time.
At first, Ron Allen denied everything. Then, investigators listed the evidence against him.
Tell me what.
Allen gave it up, for him, for his twin, and for a third man. Allen said on the night of the murder, he and his twin were out with a man named Greg Williams. He claimed Williams pulled the trigger. By 7 that evening, an arrest warrant had been issued for Williams. 5 days later, authorities arrested him in Ocilla, Georgia. But Salvatore was never convinced for a minute that Williams had been the trigger man.
The weapon used in the murder of the 2 taxi drivers were guns owned by the Allen brothers. They were guns carried by the Allen brothers. They were guns held by the Allen brothers. So it was not likely that Gregory Williams possessed the gun and killed the cab drivers. We believe that it was the Allen brothers who killed them.
On July 10, 1990, Ronald and John Allen were convicted of the taxicab murders. On August 16th, they were sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. The Allen twins will be over 100 years old when they become eligible for parole. For his part in the crime, Greg Williams was sentenced to life as well. The Allen twins and Greg Williams killed 2 men for just over $100. Money they intended to spend in New York City to buy drugs they could peddle in Trenton. In jail, the Allens bragged about robbing and killing the taxi drivers, saying they were easy targets. With ballistics evidence, so were the Allens. The Allen brothers found their victims on the streets. But staying at home doesn't necessarily mean staying safe. Los Angeles, April 17, 1991. On this morning, Marilyn Rush knew something was wrong when her friend Joan Dawley didn't show up for work. Joan was never late, and she wasn't answering her phone. Concerned, Marilyn drove to the house Joan shared with her husband Dennis to make sure she was all right. Even though Joan's car wasn't in the driveway, Marilyn went inside to check on her friend. She found her in the bedroom.
Joan? 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 Oh, God.
When the LAPD responded to the crime scene, it looked at first glance like a botched burglary. The bedroom had been ransacked. Joan Dawley's bruised hands told investigators that she had tried to defend herself. The Dawleys' neighborhood had had a rash of break-ins, and this one matched the pattern. Outside, a screen had been removed from an open window, and a ladder stood beneath it. But as police worked the scene, they began to compile a growing list of clues that didn't fit with the burglary scenario. The damp ground under the window had no footprints or marks from the ladder. The windowsill, where the burglars allegedly climbed in, was clean of any dirt or scuff marks.
I haven't seen any dirt, mud, broken leaves, pieces of leaves, nothing out there.
And $100 was left in plain sight on the kitchen counter. It appeared as if someone had worked hard to make it look like Joan Dawley had interrupted a burglary. LAPD Detective Paul Tippin wasn't convinced.
All of these things together with the evidence at supposedly the point of entry didn't add up. Initially, of course, you look at it as a burglary murder, but as it progressed, it turned out to be a fabricated crime scene, basically.
Police suspected the murderer had contrived the scene after killing Dawley. Officers notified the victim's husband, Dennis Dawley, and asked him some routine questions.
I know this is a difficult time.
If you have that type of a murder, you're going to have to eliminate the spouse. You have to get over that hurdle before you can go to the next step.
When it's fresh, so we can start.
Dennis told police that he and Joan were high school sweethearts, married 35 years. He'd last spoken to his wife the night before. She was still asleep when he left the house at 4:45 that morning for his job at the golf course. He had no idea what could have happened or who could have wanted his wife dead. He said he couldn't bear to stay in the house. If police had more questions, they could reach him at the home of his daughter, Debbie Myers.
Evidence that you can gather.
With Dennis Dawley above suspicion, Tippin pressed forward in his search for clues to this hideous murder.
We'll now take that bag.
The autopsy found that the victim had been killed by blunt force trauma to the back of her head. Tests turned up no evidence of sexual assault. The coroner discovered traces of blood and foreign matter under the victim's fingernails. But investigators had no certain way of telling whether it was the killers or the victims. In these early days of DNA technology, accurate testing required large samples. Testing the traces of material from under the victim's nails would jeopardize the sole piece of potential evidence.
My first question was, do you think we can get DNA evidence from any evidence under her nails? And the answer was yes, but once we do it, then we may destroy all of the evidence through the analysis. So I was real reluctant at that time to do it.
The risk was too great. Tippin would have to rely on old-fashioned detective work to solve this one, at least for now. 4 days after the murder, Joan Dawley's missing car reappeared. Her son-in-law spotted it in a parking lot across the street from the card store where Joan had worked. Police found her keys, but no useful clues. Two days after the victim's funeral, Detective Tippin called Dawley at his daughter's house to see if he had noticed anything else the burglars may have taken.
All right, see you when I get back.
But
Okay.
Debbie Myers told Tippin that her father was gone. Dawley said that he needed to get away. He planned to spend a few days quietly fishing at Lake Mead. Myers told Tippin the name of the Las Vegas hotel where her father usually stayed. Tippin's experience told him it was strange for a man to leave town so soon after his wife's murder. He asked a pal in the Las Vegas Metro Police Department to keep an eye on Dawley. Tippin's opinion of the bereaved husband was about to change. The Joan Dawley murder investigation took a strange turn when Dennis Dawley turned up in a Vegas casino at 3:30 in the morning. He was in the company of a woman. Detective Tippin received surveillance photos of the pair. After checking around, the woman was identified as Brandita Taliano. The news didn't sit well.
After I determined that he was in Las Vegas with a female, 2 days after he had buried his wife of 35 years, I became very suspicious.
Tippin looked into Taliano's background. He found that her rap sheet included convictions for prostitution and drugs. She had no fixed address. He also discovered that Taliano had been staying in the Mission Hills Motel in LA during the time of Joan Dawley's murder. The motel was just a quarter-mile down the road from where Joan's car had been recovered. This was worth a closer look.
So I went to the Mission Hills Motel, talked with the manager, and basically what happened was he gave me a list of phone calls and phone numbers going back a month.
Tippin checked the list of Taliano's outgoing calls. She had phoned Dawley's home, the golf complex where he worked, and a local bowling alley that was his favorite hangout.
Police Department, Miss Taliano?
It was time to pay a call on Taliano. He traced her to a North Hollywood motel.
Yes, ma'am. I'm Detective Tippin from the Police Department. I have a team
Detectives
of
approached
officers
Taliano and asked to search her room.
Here.
Surprisingly, she agreed without blinking an eye.
You wanna take that?
Generally speaking, I mean, if someone is that cooperative, they're not thinking that they have anything that may develop into a lead or lead you to believe that they were involved in a homicide.
The search turned up several pieces of jewelry. Most of it was junk. But one piece looked particularly valuable, and not the kind of jewelry Taliano would normally own. Taliano had an explanation ready. She told them that she was often hired to clean the Dawley's house. While she was there, she took some jewelry, but not entirely without Dennis's knowledge. They were having an affair.
She wanted us to believe that basically she was okay with being around Joan Dawley and Dennis. But Joan didn't know that the sexual activity was taking place.
Detective Tippin.
Detectives found a note stating that Dennis was nervous about Taliano keeping the jewelry. He wanted her to fence it. That suggested he was involved in its theft.
Very nice piece of jewelry here.
A few days later, Debbie Myers identified the jewelry. She recognized the piece that her mother always wore. If that were true, then Taliano couldn't have stolen it from the victim's jewelry box.
The other side.
Joan's jewelry in Taliano's possession, and a note linking Dolly to the stolen pieces. Too many coincidences were piling up too quickly.
She was a participant in the
Perhaps
homicide.
their secret game didn't stop at theft.
Once I identified Brandita Taliano and the things that were going on with her and Dennis Dolly, it became more and more apparent that it was a conspiracy and that these two people were involved in the case.
Investigators began to believe that Joan Dolly's murder was a crime motivated by love. Not Dennis and Brandita's love for each other, but their mutual adoration for money. If Dennis divorced his wife, he'd lose half of everything he owned. Plus, Joan had recently inherited close to $100,000. Police suspected that Dennis Dolly was a shifty and dangerous man. If he and Brandita had plotted to kill Joan because Dolly wanted all of her money, then why would he want to share it with Brandita?
Routine, right? You'll be all right.
I was somewhat concerned about Brandita also and her situation because I thought the possibility was there that Dennis would murder Brandita just to get her out of the way.
The evidence against the pair was only circumstantial. Investigators had no physical evidence putting them at the murder scene on the morning of April 17th. But they had enough to bring them in for questioning. At least then, authorities could keep their eyes on the pair. Based on what they had gathered so far, detectives developed a strategy. They had 48 hours to either charge them or let them go. It was a calculated risk.
Interrogation room 2.
Tippin knew he didn't have the evidence to charge them, so he was gambling that once in custody, they'd crack and turn on each other.
Right here, man. Mr. John, will you come with me, please?
Dennis admitted to meeting Brandita Taliano on the street, and basically that's all he would admit to was, yes, he was wrong and connecting up with Brandita and having her as a girlfriend, but as far as the murder or anything else, he was not involved in anything.
You've given me so far. I'll be right back. Sure. I'm gonna go next door. Okay.
Taliano told a different story.
Hi, Miss Taliano. How are you today?
A few months before Joan's murder, Taliano had been serving time in a women's prison in Los Angeles.
Well, got a lot of loose
While
ends.
visiting her there, Dolly had asked her a favor. Did she know anyone he could hire for a big job? She assumed that meant murdering his wife.
Can you describe for me your relationship?
Taliano recommended a man named Gary Ware.
I'll let you know. He's pretty adamant about it.
You know, he called me.
Dolly's deal with Ware must have been finalized while Taliano was in prison.
Do everything.
She said Dolly never told her what happened. It was a hot lead, but investigators would need a lot more evidence to turn it into a murder charge that would stick. And Tippin's 48 hours were up. Authorities were forced to let Dolly and Taliano go. Ware was no choir boy. A man with a criminal record like his might be capable of committing murder for hire. His phone records showed that Dolly called him prior to Joan's death, but not afterward.
All of a sudden, I have him right in the middle of this homicide with phone calls that are being directed to him by Dennis Dolly. So I had to find out why those calls were being made and what his participation or involvement was.
How you doing?
Gary Ware, how you doing?
But a hardened criminal like Ware wouldn't just volunteer information
Yes,
to the
sir.
police. Tippin spent a year trying to get him to talk. With his attorney present, Ware finally admitted to authorities that Dawley had contacted him with an interesting business proposition. The two agreed to meet. Dawley wanted Ware to kill his wife. He gave Ware $30,000 cash and told him he didn't care how Ware did it, but he wanted her gone. At first, Tippin couldn't understand why Ware would implicate himself in Joan Dawley's murder like this. As it turned out, he had an airtight alibi. On the morning the victim was murdered, he was in lockup at Chino State Prison. Tippin's most promising lead fizzled right before his eyes. After more than a year spent investigating Joan Dawley's murder, the case went cold. Though LAPD detectives had their suspicion, they still needed hard evidence placing Dennis Dawley and Brandita Taliano at the scene of the murder of Joan Dawley. One lead after another failed to pay off. Then, on the last day of February 1994, Detective Paul Tippin got a call that he'd been waiting 3 years for. In the time since Joan Dawley's murder, DNA analysis technology had been refined enormously. A new technique allowed even a tiny pinpoint of genetic material to be analyzed. Now, the lab could accurately test only a portion of the foreign matter found under the victim's nails without the risk of ruining the entire DNA sample. The lab's new testing technology, called PCR for polymerase chain reaction, encourages the DNA to carry out its natural function, continuous duplication. A carefully controlled environment of chemicals and heat works like a genetic copying machine. Colin Yamauchi is a criminalist with the LAPD Crime Lab DNA unit.
We can start with a small sample and put it in this instrument that can make hundreds and then thousands and then hundreds of thousands and millions of copies of that same DNA. So it was kind of an exciting time in forensic serology when PCR came online and we were able to utilize this technology.
With PCR, an immeasurable amount of DNA can be cultivated into a testable sample. The procedure was performed on a portion of material taken from beneath Joan Dawley's fingernails, then compared with DNA from her blood. It didn't match. Someone else's cells were under Joan Dawley's nails.
Now, that meant that the possibility of a suspect's DNA was there. And that was very, very important to me, because now it brought about a situation where I could maybe directly connect a suspect to the victim. And that was very, very important.
Dennis Dawley's genetic material was tested against the sample from his wife's nails. It came back negative. By this time, Brandita Taliano was in prison for an unrelated crime. A warrant was issued and a blood sample obtained. This time, Tippin got his match. Now there could be no doubt. Brandita Taliano murdered Joan Dawley. But Tippin still wasn't convinced that Taliano had acted alone. Dennis Dawley's knowledge of the stolen jewelry, his attempt to hire a hitman, and a long string of incriminating phone records before the crime implicated him in the murder.
I believe truly that they were both in it, they were both involved in it, they were both there when it happened.
The jury agreed that Dennis Dawley and Brandita Taliano had conspired and murdered Joan Dawley. Nearly 4 years after her death, her killers were sentenced to 25 years to life. Dawley and Taliano believed that murder was the easy way to wealth. Unfortunately, they weren't the only ones to feel that way. Some people make murder a part of their business plan. Livingston County, north central Missouri. Over 100 years ago, this was wild, rough country under the rule of frontier justice. Today, it has settled into the essence of rural America. Old-style towns surrounded by farmland. A place where farmers contend with the whims of the weather and the realities of economics. People here believe in an honest wage for honest work. At least most of them believe that. In October 1986, the Livingston County Sheriff's Department received a call from a nearby livestock auction company. A man named Dennis Murphy had passed a bad check for $6,000 to buy cattle. He had paid for the cattle, loaded them into a truck, and vanished. Though Murphy was a stranger, he appeared to be working with a local farmer named Ray Copeland. Ray had attended the auction, and while he hadn't bought any livestock, he provided a truck for the cattle Murphy had bought. Sheriff Gary Calvert paid Mr. Copeland a visit to find out more about Murphy.
He admitted that he knew Dennis Murphy, that Dennis had rented his pasture to keep those cows, and that he in fact had sold some cows to Dennis himself, and that Dennis had gave him a bad check also.
It might have been the end of the story, except that a month later, Calvert received another call about a drifter passing bad checks for about $6,000 worth of livestock. The drifter resold the cows, took the cash, and disappeared. Again, Ray Copeland had been at the auction, and it was his truck that carted the cattle away. But once again, Copeland said he was a victim too.
You did 5 of them already. And
while that may have been true, Calvert had reasons for doubt. Ray Copeland had been arrested several times for passing bad checks of his own.
Yeah, we're gonna have to come up with something different.
Still, Calvert had no proof that he was behind this. Both of the cattle thieves had arrest records, consistently bouncing in and out of jail on minor charges. Calvert assumed they were bound to get arrested again. He'd catch up with them soon enough. All he had to do was wait. Two years passed without any more trouble. Then, in October 1988, Calvert learned about 3 more drifters passing bad paper for good cattle. This wasn't the kind of crime Calvert had seen a lot of. Now he'd seen 5 cases in 24 months. They had to be related. When Calvert ran a check on the 2 men who'd stolen the cows 2 years earlier, he found no record of them. They hadn't been arrested again anywhere.
Misdemeanor 1.
Calvert couldn't believe that these small-time criminals had reformed into model citizens. But he didn't know where they had gone, or if Copeland might truly be involved. Calvert had heard rumors, though. Copeland's neighbors told him that he was hiring drifters from the local mission to help him at cattle auctions because he couldn't hear well anymore. Copeland supposedly promised to pay the men $50 a day to stay on his farm and not tell anyone they were there.
Let's go.
Even if those rumors were true, they didn't mean much. A year passed before Calvert got more information, and it wasn't what he expected. On August 20th, 1989, an anonymous caller to Nebraska's Crime Stoppers hotline tipped authorities to watch out for Ray and Fay Copeland of Mooresville, Missouri. The caller said that he had worked for the Copelands. Ray had made him buy cattle with bad checks and then threatened to kill him. He said he wasn't the first. He hinted that Ray was a murderer.
Jack McCormick?
On September 6, 1989, just 2 weeks after the phone tip, the anonymous caller surfaced. Jack McCormick was picked up outside Salem, Oregon for sleeping by the side of a highway. When the police computer revealed an outstanding warrant for bad checks in Missouri, he was extradited. When he got there, he admitted making the anonymous call.
Jack, you have a slight problem with
McCormick said that Copeland met him in a homeless shelter and hired him to work on his farm. After he moved into Copeland's house, Copeland opened a bank account for him so he could buy cattle. It seemed like a square deal. But McCormick grew suspicious when he found a closet full of men's clothes that belonged to other men from the shelter. Some had their names written inside, a common practice among drifters.
$5,000.
All done.
During the 15 days he lived at the farm, McCormick said he made several cattle purchases for Ray and Fay Copeland.
630 now, 640. 630 now, 640.
Fay kept the
Where'd you get
books,
her from? She's a Sheila.
but soon McCormick overdrew the bank account and the Sullivan County Sheriff issued a warrant for his arrest. Right after that, on August 10, 1989, McCormick claimed that Copeland tried to kill him with a .22 rifle. Then, for some reason, Copeland changed his mind. McCormick fled the county. It sounded like a wild story, but the sheriff couldn't dismiss it out of hand. Then came the wildest accusation of all. McCormick said he found a human skull and leg bone on Copeland's farm.
When he suggested that what might be happening here is that Mr. Copeland may be killing people, we thought we better look into it.
Based on what McCormick told authorities, and coupled with the fact that 2 of the cattle thieves were seen with Ray Copeland, the sheriff had enough to arrest Ray and his wife Fay for charges relating to check fraud. A search warrant was issued to determine if they were up to something far worse. A drifter named Jack McCormick accused Ray and Fay Copeland of murder. He said the evidence was buried on their farm. On October 9, 1989, the couple was taken into custody.
Step up. Right over the wall. No, sir. Sir, you're under arrest for the devil. Sit up. Back here and down.
With the Copelands behind bars at the Livingston County Jail, the officers searched the farmhouse. They found items that seemed to substantiate Jack McCormick's account.
Why don't you go ahead and bag this rifle up?
First was the closet of men's clothes.
We have the victim's clothing up here.
Fay had been cutting them up to make a quilt. Some of the clothes had the names of the missing men in them, just as McCormick had described. The officers also found a list of men's names hidden in a camera case. It included the men who had passed bad checks. The ones who vanished had X's beside them.
Let's go ahead, keep track of that.
If McCormick was telling the truth and Copeland was a killer, Sheriff Calvert would have to find the bodies. But after a week of searching, the officers found no trace of the missing men. While the Copeland farm was being searched, TV stations began reporting on the case. Rancher Keith Albright saw the story and called the sheriff to report what he knew.
Yeah, this is Mr. Albright out here on Alaskan Road.
Albright had rented a farm just 6 miles from Copeland's.
Pretty good.
Ray had done some odd jobs for him. Albright told police that he had found some bones out in a field. At the time, he thought they were animal bones. Now, he wasn't so sure. Having found no bodies on Copeland's farm, police believed that Albright might be onto something. If Copeland were guilty, he wouldn't be careless enough to bury all his victims on his own land. They spread out to search Albright's farm. In the barn, they noticed that some areas of the dirt floor had been disturbed. They began to dig. By the end of the day, officers uncovered 3 bodies from shallow graves on Albright's property. Calls kept pouring into the sheriff's department, and they tracked down every promising lead.
When people found out that we were suspicious of what he may have been doing, they became suspicious about everything that they had seen him doing. So we went on a lot of wild goose chases.
All right, looks like we have something down here. Don't quite know what it is.
When the bodies started turning up,
Let's see what we
Copeland,
got here.
perhaps trying to minimize his involvement, began telling wild stories. He said he overheard some strangers talking about dumping a body down a neighbor's well. Sure enough, investigators found the body of one of the missing drifters. But the lie backfired. The discovery implicated Copeland even further.
All right, lay it down here. We got.
The search on that farm intensified, and a 5th victim was excavated from beneath 2,000 bales of hay. Using dental records, the 5 men were positively identified a few weeks later. Among them was Dennis Murphy, pulled from his watery grave. It was a good start, but investigators needed forensic evidence to tie Copeland more directly to the murdered men. Calvert gathered the .22 rifle found in Copeland's house and a pile of .22 slugs recovered from the bodies and delivered them to the Missouri State Highway Patrol. The rifle was test-fired in their crime lab. It would leave its unique set of markings on the slugs as they hurled down the barrel. A comparison microscope was used to compare the markings. On one side, the test-fired slug. On the other, a slug pulled from one of the 5 murder victims. The marks on the slugs lined up exactly. To firearms and ballistics expert Todd Garrison, that meant only one thing.
After comparison and examinations, we could conclusively say this particular bullet had been fired from this particular Marlin firearm obtained from the Copeland farm.
Bullets from the same rifle killed each of the 5 victims. But investigators still needed to know if Faye Copeland had any role in this. The note found in the Copeland's house told volumes. Ray, who was illiterate, couldn't have written the names on the list. To see if she was the author, Calvert turned the list over to Missouri State Highway Patrol's handwriting section. Though a person's handwriting varies, certain features remain consistent. Handwriting expert Don Locke compared the note against a known sample of Faye's handwriting. He noted several distinctive characteristics. For example, the letter B always appeared in uppercase, even in the middle of a word. Locke concluded that this and other details were common to the note and to examples of Faye's handwriting. But what about the X's? It was possible that Faye had simply written the list of names and Ray had placed the X's by them as he killed the men. That would be harder to judge.
Could one simply look at the X's and positively identify those X's to someone? No. But they were there, and as I said, they were consistent with the writing that was positively identified.
Locke even compared the ink used to write the names against the ink used to write the X's. His conclusion? The same ink had been used for both. Faye Copeland wrote the names and marked the X's as her husband killed the men one by one. Locke and Garrison provided the forensic evidence to charge the Copelands with 5 counts of first-degree murder. On November 12, 1990, Faye was sentenced to death. Ray followed her on May 22, 1991. For 2 years, Faye and Ray Copeland were the only couple on death row sentenced for the same crime. Ray Copeland cheated the executioner when he died in October 1993 at the Potosi Correctional Center. In 1999, his wife of over 50 years had her sentence reduced to life. Though neither of the Copelands ever confessed, investigators pieced together this scenario. Ray somehow came up with the idea of hiring drifters to write the checks for him.
Get that gate. Make sure that gate is locked. Yeah, the gate. Got the gate. Come on.
After the men outlived their usefulness, or when the warrants for passing bad checks piled up,
There you go.
Copeland murdered them. And Faye kept the books. How much is a human life worth? Police estimated that the Copelands made $30,000 from their scheme. $6,000 a victim. They thought no one would notice a few missing drifters. They were wrong. It's often said that 2 heads are better than 1. When committing murder, having a partner gives police twice as much evidence to gather and twice as much chance to catch the killers. A woman has been murdered. Police are sure of that. But nothing else is what it appears to be. Investigators must sort out who's the victim and who's the killer. A father's greeting cards are no cause for joy when his daughter suspects he's not the man he pretends to be. To find the truth, detectives follow a paper trail through a maze of lies. A bungled murder and a twist of fate tip investigators off to a killer's elaborate scheme. But to win a conviction, they'll need his cooperation. Taking a life. Some killers take the phrase literally. After the kill, they assume their victims' lives, concealing their crime and hiding within their new stolen identity. Home to more than 1 million people, Detroit is Michigan's largest and toughest city. And like most metropolitan areas its size, it sees its share of crime. On May 4th, 1994, Betty Cole arrived at the Detroit Police Department to report her 32-year-old sister Annie missing. She said that Annie had left to run a quick errand with her boyfriend, Mo Jones, several hours earlier, but hadn't returned. Jones was allegedly involved in drugs, and Betty was worried that something bad had happened to her sister. But police policy requires at least 24 hours before a missing persons investigation can be opened. Betty would have to wait.
Why don't you go home? She's probably there asleep.
Though upset, she returned home, hopeful that her sister would soon turn up.
Why don't you go home?
The following morning, an anonymous 911 call brought police to an abandoned warehouse. When they arrived, Betty Cole and members of her family were waiting outside. Betty had also received an anonymous call from a man who claimed that her sister Annie was inside. Officers made their way into the building. At the end of a corridor, they found the lifeless body of a young woman. She had been shot 3 times in the head. Police returned outside and asked Betty to identify the body. When she saw the victim, she broke down. She confirmed that it was her sister, Annie Cole. Forensics technicians began processing the scene. Near the body, they collected 3 spent small caliber shells. They also found a purse nearby, but it contained no cash, credit cards, or any form of identification. The bullets recovered from the victim were sent to the Detroit Forensic Services lab. There, Sergeant Paul Hartzell analyzed the slugs and the recovered shell casings using a digital micrometer.
The micrometer is a tool that we can use to help us determine caliber of a bullet, or to help us determine a probable make of a particular bullet. This is done by mounting the bullet either with the base up, so we can measure the diameter of the bullet to help us determine caliber, or we can actually measure the lands and grooves on the bullet to help us determine a probable make of a weapon that may have fired that bullet.
Each brand of gun creates its own characteristic pattern on a slug. And every individual firearm leaves unique marks on a bullet, like the gun's fingerprint. Analysis of the markings on the 3 slugs recovered from the victim led examiners to conclude that it was one gun, a .22 caliber Smith & Wesson that had been used to commit the murder, indicating a lone triggerman. Sergeant Patrick Hennahan of the Detroit Police Department began his investigation by looking for the last person reported to have been with Annie Cole. Her boyfriend, Mo Jones.
Trying to identify him and find out where he might be.
We weren't able to develop any information on a Mo Jones. We searched, department arrest records, narcotics bureau records, things of that nature. We weren't able to come up with anything.
While the search for the mysterious Mo Jones was underway, investigators tried to learn as much as they could about Annie Cole. The victim's fingerprints recovered from the crime scene were entered into the police database containing fingerprint records. After an extensive search, the database turned up no matches. Annie Cole had apparently stayed out of trouble until this terrible day.
That's all you know is it's on Finkel.
Unable to locate the victim's boyfriend, Detective Hennahan relied on Betty Cole for information. But after a few days, it seemed she had disappeared.
I made another attempt after the weekend to contact her, and it was almost as if she had fallen off the face of the earth all of a sudden.
Pat, why don't you take a look at this?
With no clear leads in sight, he enlisted the aid of homicide detective Monica Childs.
We received from the
Her initial investigation revealed some troubling inconsistencies. Though the victim's prints were not on file with the police department, a records check revealed an extensive felony record under the name of Annie Cole. In fact, a warrant was currently out for her arrest on a probation violation. Trying to resolve the conflicting information, examiners compared the prints recovered at the crime scene with those contained in Annie Cole's criminal records. They didn't match. Annie Cole and the victim found at the warehouse were not the same person. And though there were several people named Annie Cole living in the Detroit metropolitan area, the victim and the known criminal shared a common address. Looking for answers, police went to the funeral home where the victim's body was being kept.
Could you give me some information on the Cole case?
There, the director stated that Betty Cole had been in 4 days earlier to request a speedy cremation for her sister.
She was in here 4 days ago.
Betty had stressed that there wasn't to be a service.
Well, it's strange when she knows there's an ongoing investigation.
The cremation was scheduled for the following day. For Detective Monica Childs, the arrangements made no sense.
Due to the age of the victim and me being an African American, I know culturally we have a service, okay? If there's no body, we have a memorial service. Even if the person is cremated, there's a service. And Pat and I talked about it. He said, that doesn't sound right. That sounds a little odd. I said, that is very unusual.
Here's some of the crime scene photos.
Investigators' strongest clue in this unusual case lay in a casket that was about to be incinerated.
She doesn't have her shoes on, but the shoes are there.
They obtained a court order to postpone the cremation. To sort things out, police needed to find Betty Cole, the woman who claimed to be the victim's sister. At the address Betty had given as her own, investigators were met by a man named James Shaver. He said he was Annie Cole's brother. He stated it was impossible that Annie had been murdered a week ago. He had just seen her the day before, leaving on a trip to Mississippi. And he had never heard of Betty Cole. He agreed to accompany police to the funeral home to try to identify the body. Shaver viewed the body with a total lack of recognition.
I don't know who this woman is. This is not my sister, no.
This woman, whoever she was not his sister, Annie. If anyone could identify the nameless victim found in the warehouse, it was the fictitious Betty Cole, who was nowhere to be found. For investigators, it was clear that she was deeply involved in this deadly charade. Detroit police struggled to make sense of a bizarre murder investigation. Forensic evidence proved that the young female victim thought to be Annie Cole was misidentified, and the woman who had ID'd her was now missing.
You've only talked to her over the phone. You've never seen
Hoping to give a name to the victim found shot to death in the warehouse, police scoured recent missing persons reports. One matched their victim.
You have a boyfriend?
Quinetta and Roy Spruill had reported their 28-year-old niece Stella missing on May 4th, the day before the body was found. Stella's co-workers had called the Spruills looking for her.
Doesn't make a lot of sense.
The employees said that when Stella left for lunch that day, she was going to meet someone, though she never said who. She seemed upbeat. But when Stella failed to return, they began to worry. The day after Stella's disappearance, a department store clerk called the Spruills looking for their niece. Stella had just applied for a credit card, and the store needed to verify some information on her application. The Spruills couldn't imagine that Stella would just take off without a word.
Stella Spruill, from what we learned from the family, was a religious young lady, a loyal friend, just an all-around good person.
Police asked the Spruills to view the body found at the warehouse, which had since been returned to the medical examiner's office. The victim was their niece, Stella Spruill. Now, police had to figure out who had murdered her and why. Detectives contacted the department store where Stella had allegedly filled out the credit card application. A surveillance camera had captured the transaction. Detectives recognized the woman in the video, and it wasn't Stella Spruill. It was the person who had identified herself as Betty Cole, the victim's sister, at the crime scene. Now, she was on tape impersonating Stella. And though investigators were convinced that the woman in the video was the real Annie Cole, they still had to determine how she was connected to Stella Spruill. Hoping to find an answer, they went to Stella's workplace. Employees there recognized the woman from the tape. Her name, they said, was Annie Cole. She used to work there with Stella, and the two were friends. For investigators, there was little doubt that Annie Cole was behind the murder of Stella Spruill. Now they needed proof. Police turned to Annie Cole's family for help. Annie's brother and one of her daughters were brought in for questioning. Police believed they might be able to identify the male voice on the anonymous 911 call that brought police to the warehouse where the victim's body was discovered. James Shaver didn't recognize the voice. But Annie Cole's daughter believed she did.
While listening to the copy of the 911 tape, the one daughter said, "Well, that's my cousin Leander."
Annie Cole's 17-year-old nephew, Leander Foster, was brought in for questioning. Police recognized him as being with the fictitious Betty Cole at the warehouse when the body was discovered.
Annie Cole.
Foster, who had no criminal record, broke down under questioning.
He asked me to help her out.
He admitted that Annie had promised him and his best friend $5,000 each to kill Stella Spruill.
She didn't want to go to jail, so
The day before the murder, Annie arranged to meet Stella at a mall parking lot. Leander and his partner were nearby, getting a look at their intended victim.
So, I mean, she showed us where she hangs out.
The next day, when Stella arrived on her lunch hour to meet Annie again, Leander Foster and his friend were waiting. They abducted her at gunpoint, forced her inside the car, and took her to the abandoned warehouse.
Get in that room right there.
There, Foster said he shot her 3 times with a .22 caliber Smith & Wesson that Annie had given him for the job. They cleaned out her purse and gave Stella's ID to Annie. The next day, after Annie Cole filed the false missing persons report, Leander called the police to report the body.
Annie's idea. This is all Annie's idea. So
He didn't know what happened to the murder weapon.
ID that she wanted.
On May 11th, 1994, a week after Stella Spruill was murdered, Annie Cole was tracked down at a relative's house in Indianola, Mississippi. She was arrested and taken back to Detroit for questioning. But police had already pieced together the motive behind Annie Cole's deadly scheme.
Annie Cole was probably a consummate con person. She was aware of outstanding warrants for her arrest, and made a calculated decision that she didn't want to go back to prison. Based on her interviews with co-defendants and witnesses, she set in place a plan to assume another person's identity and disappear into the sunset, if you will, and live happily ever after.
To fake her own death, Annie needed a real victim. But she had no one in mind.
Run that back by me again.
The victim found her.
Yeah, this week has been good.
Stella Spruill called her former co-worker to invite her to a makeup demonstration. Annie declined, but realized in that instant who her victim was going to be. Trusting, hard-working Stella Spruill.
Bye.
Annie Cole was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Leander Foster also received a life sentence. The other accomplice pled guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Some people kill to purify their reputations. Others are motivated by pure greed. Bonner County, Idaho lies nestled between Washington State to the west and Montana to the east.
Here you go, Ted.
But in 1994, it found itself in the middle of a mystery. In late February, Shelley Kepley arrived at the Bonner County Sheriff's Office.
And everything seemed to be in order. What's his name?
She had flown in from Reno, Nevada to check on her father, Paul Gruber, who lived in the area.
In fact, perhaps he decided to take off.
She suspected that something was terribly wrong.
What?
Shelley said she'd last seen her father a month earlier when he'd come to Reno for the holidays. At age 54, he was independently wealthy as a result of good investments and had recently retired from teaching school. He'd been living in Idaho for about 6 months and seemed happy there. But over the past month or so, Shelley and her son had received several greeting cards and cash gifts from her father. But the signature on the cards didn't really look like his writing. And her repeated phone calls to him went unanswered. If he had gone on a trip, he would have told her his plans. Believing that someone may be impersonating her dad, Shelley didn't know where else to turn. Investigators forwarded the documents to the Idaho Department of Law Enforcement Crime Lab. There, examiners compared Gruber's known writing samples with the signatures on the greeting cards. But there wasn't enough to work with, and examiners could not exclude Paul Gruber as the person who signed the cards. Though police had no evidence of foul play, they agreed to look into the matter. Under the circumstances, Shelley had been given power of attorney over her father's estate. She gave police permission to search his property. Lieutenant Harvey Thompson went to Gruber's house to look around. Shelley had told him that her father kept his financial records and an inventory of his possessions in a locked box hidden in the crawl space. Lieutenant Thompson went there to recover it.
There was an inventory in it. There were titles to vehicles in it. There was a little bit of jewelry in it and insurance papers.
With the inventory now in hand, investigators made their way through the house.
Empty.
Plastic sheets covering the furniture suggested that Gruber had gone away for an extended period of time. It soon became apparent that several items on the list were nowhere to be found. And they were not the type of things one packs simply to go on a trip.
I found out about guns being missing. I found out computer equipment that should have been there was gone. A gun safe was gone. Just a lot of stuff was gone.
It seemed Shelley Kepley's concerns about her missing father were well-founded. And though there was no physical evidence to support it, police were now starting to believe that harm had come to Paul Gruber. Police in Bonner County, Idaho, continued searching for clues in the mysterious disappearance of 54-year-old Paul Gruber. And though no one had heard from him in some time, his accounts were still active. While scouring financial records obtained from Gruber's bank, Lieutenant Thompson found something suspicious. Paul Gruber had been paying someone else's mortgage. And from what police had learned, that seemed completely out of character.
From talking to Shelley Kepley, Mr. Gruber's daughter, Mr. Gruber didn't pay other people's mortgages. He didn't loan other people his vehicles. You know, what's Mr. Gruber's pretty well stays Mr. Gruber's.
Darrell Kuehl, the man whose mortgage was being paid for by Gruber, was brought in for questioning. He told police he was a general contractor who had done extensive work at Gruber's house.
February 27th.
He said he was starting a new home security business and other ventures that Paul Gruber had decided to invest in.
Come back, give an estimate on.
Rather than investing cash, however, Gruber had agreed to make payments to Kuehl's mortgage company. To investigators, that arrangement didn't sound like something Shelley Kepley's father would agree to. To be certain they were talking about the same person, police showed Kuehl a photograph of Paul Gruber. But Kuehl didn't recognize him. That wasn't the man he knew. Someone else, it seemed, was trying to pass himself off as Paul Gruber.
This is Tony, I'm sketch artist. Now you tell him.
Investigators asked him to describe the man who hired him to a police sketch artist. If police were to have any hope of finding the missing Paul Gruber, they would first have to identify the impostor.
Sir, can I talk to you a moment?
Armed with the sketch, police canvassed Gruber's neighborhood,
Bonner County Police. I was wondering,
but nobody recognized the face.
I don't know. I've never seen a guy in the neighborhood around here.
And no one had seen Gruber for some time. As the race to put a name to the face in the sketch intensified, investigators got a break. The manager of the local post office had heard of the disappearance and informed police that Paul Gruber's mail was still being picked up from his P.O. box.
yeah, sure. Listen, do me a favor.
He turned over a tape from a security camera that was located near Gruber's box. The video revealed 3 men at different times in the vicinity of Gruber's P.O. box. One of them, partially obscured and in profile, looked familiar.
One of the mails that was at Mr. Gruber's box during the period of time appeared to be that of Darrell Kuehl.
Suddenly, the investigation's best witness was becoming the prime suspect. Though the image on the video was not conclusive, it was enough for investigators to obtain a warrant to search Kuehl's property. Inside his home, they found a variety of tools, electronic equipment, and other items that were similar to those missing from Paul Gruber's residence. Darrell Kuehl insisted the things belonged to him. But detectives discovered that some of the items had serial numbers matching the inventory from Gruber's safe. Though police suspected Kuehl had killed Gruber and then assumed his identity in order to cash in on his victim's wealth, they found nothing to support a murder charge.
I had enough probable cause to arrest him for maybe theft and possibly forgery, but we didn't have a body. I couldn't prove that anything had actually happened to Mr. Gruber.
Feeling something may have been overlooked, Lieutenant Thompson ordered another search of Gruber's home. One of the investigators had found a strange depression in the crawl space, and the excavation team began digging beneath the house. They kept at it for hours, but with no luck. Then, about 2 feet down, they were overcome by the unmistakable smell of a decomposing body. Police in northern Idaho were getting closer to solving the mysterious disappearance of 54-year-old Paul Gruber. Digging in the crawl space of Gruber's home, police believed they had finally found him.
We went under the house and about 2.5 feet down found a white plastic trash bag, took it out, and found several pairs of glasses and glass case in it. Also a distinct odor of a deteriorating body.
17 months after being reported missing by his daughter, Paul Gruber's body was found, wrapped in an air mattress and buried beneath his own house. He had been shot 6 times. Police theorized that Paul Gruber had been killed in order to clear the way for someone to steal his identity and access his wealth. Investigators believed that someone was Darrell Kuehl. Now they had to prove it. And the best way to do that was to physically link him to the scheme to steal Gruber's identity. The greeting cards that Gruber's daughter received, allegedly from her father, were sent to the lab for DNA analysis. Examiners removed the stamps from the envelopes, hoping to find DNA from the person who mailed them. But according to Carla Finnis of the Idaho Department of Law Enforcement Crime Lab, finding usable DNA samples on the back of a stamp was a long shot.
When you're talking about a stamp or an envelope, the cellular material comes from cells that have been sloughed off into the saliva from the cheeks and the tongue of the individual who licks the stamp or envelope. One can imagine that that's considerably less DNA than one would find in a normal blood sample.
Still, examiners were able to isolate and extract a single minute trace of saliva. The sample was enough for a DNA profile to be developed. Now, they needed a source of comparison. Despite his protestations of innocence, Darrell Kuehl was arrested for suspicion of murdering Paul Gruber. Once in custody, police wasted no time obtaining a blood sample. The evidence was sent back to the crime lab. Examiners generated a DNA profile of Darrell Kuehl. The results were then compared to the profile generated from the stamp. The conclusion was indisputable. Darrell Kuehl had licked those stamps. Police had made their case. From what investigators could determine, Kuehl had a history of shady business schemes. He saw his employer, the wealthy, retired Paul Gruber, as an easy mark. But Gruber must have seen through the scams, refusing to be taken in. Kuehl then came up with another plan to get to his money. He would become Paul Gruber. Darrell Kuehl was found guilty of first-degree murder, grand theft, and forgery. He received 25 years for murder and 25 years for theft. A daughter's diligence made it hard for Kuehl to maintain his charade. But some predators rely on the vulnerability and isolation of their victims to work their schemes. On August 15, 1997, state police were dispatched to the home of 56-year-old Thomas Wayne Jones in Milford, Delaware. When Jones's home care nurse arrived for work, she found traces of blood on the floor. The house had been ransacked. Valuable coins and several financial records appeared to be missing. Her employer, who was confined to a wheelchair, was nowhere to be found.
Some firearms, and we're gonna need to take some prints. I'm gonna need a print kit.
Outside, police combed the grounds for any clues to Jones's whereabouts. One of the officers followed faint tire tracks that disappeared into a field. They led him 500 yards from the house and directly to the body of Thomas Wayne Jones. He had been shot in the back of the neck, but was still alive. Emergency personnel rushed to the scene. The wealthy entrepreneur was in critical condition, but still conscious. He managed to tell police the identity of his attacker, a longtime friend named George Calamaris. Jones said that after being shot, Calamaris placed him in a white pickup truck and dumped him in the field. A warrant was issued for Calamaris' arrest. Records indicated that Calamaris was living across the Delaware border in Silver Spring, Maryland. There, officers from the Montgomery County Police Department were asked to bring in the suspect in the shooting of Thomas Wayne Jones. But when police went to pick Calamaris up, he wasn't home. Calamaris' wife, Noreen, stated that she had not heard from her husband in a few days. But she agreed to contact the police if and when she heard from him. Police were skeptical that Calamaris' wife would actually turn him in. But a few hours later, Montgomery County Detective Terry Ryan received a call.
Mrs. Calamaris notified the police once she was contacted by George Calamaris. He was living in a wooded area, essentially on the lam, close to the home, and he contacted her in an effort to get some money and clothing.
Mrs. Calamaris told police that her husband was on his way to a nearby convenience store to buy supplies. When he exited the store, police were waiting. They moved in and made the arrest. He was transported to the Maryland Detention Center and booked for the attempted murder of Thomas Wayne Jones. Calamaris admitted he was friends with Jones. Having recently returned to the area after living in North Carolina, Calamaris had gone to visit Jones that morning. He strongly denied any knowledge of the attack. Though investigators suspected that Calamaris was lying, they had no obvious motive and no hard evidence linking him to the crime.
John.
Believing Calamaris's truck used to transport the victim into the field would yield valuable clues, police spent the next few months trying to track it down. But its whereabouts remained unknown. Then they got a tip. An anonymous caller told police that the pickup truck could be found at a machine shop in nearby Dickerson, Maryland, owned by one of Calamaris's friends. But when they arrived, investigators saw no sign of the truck. The shop owner denied any knowledge of the vehicle, though he admitted he was friends with George Calamaris. The lead appeared to be a waste of time, until a bundle of mail caught the detective's eye. The name on the letters bore a striking similarity to the name of the shooting victim in Delaware.
It was several pieces of mail from a bank in North Carolina addressed to a person named Gary Wayne Thomas. We knew that this similarity in names, our Delaware victim, Thomas Wayne Jones, was probably more than a coincidence. In fact, at the point we expected it was probably some alias that Calamaris had contrived from the Jones case.
The shop owner claimed that he didn't know who Gary Wayne Thomas was. He said Thomas's mail arrived there and George Calamaris picked it up. And now that Calamaris was in prison awaiting extradition to Delaware, his wife collected it. Unsure if this clue was related to the shooting of Thomas Wayne Jones in Delaware, Montgomery County Detective Joe Montano contacted the North Carolina bank to see if there really was a client by the name of Gary Wayne Thomas.
Thomas Wayne Jones. They said, yes, there was. And I said, well, can you describe him to me? And I fully expected them to describe the way George Calamaris looks. And they described somebody completely different. And I asked, well, when is the last time you saw Gary Wayne Thomas? And the bank said, well, come to think of it, probably 1996, the middle of 96. And this was over a year later.
According to bank records, Gary Wayne Thomas was worth millions. And no one had seen him in over a year.
I see they continue.
As police struggled to figure out the connection, word came in that Thomas Wayne Jones died as a result of his injuries from the shooting attack. Now, police shifted their focus to building a murder case against their suspect, George Calamaris. While police struggled to link George Calamaris to the murder of Thomas Wayne Jones in Delaware, their investigation uncovered a strange clue. Calamaris was receiving mail from a bank in North Carolina for a man named Gary Wayne Thomas. Unsure who this person was or how he was connected to George Calamaris, authorities contacted police in North Carolina. Detective Ricky Best of the Greenville Police Department was asked to pursue the lead.
They were asking me to check at a certain location here in Greenville to try to locate Gary Wayne Thomas. That they were investigating a murder case themselves, and they wanted to find out if Gary Wayne Thomas existed.
Detective Best began by speaking to the manager of the bank where the letters to Gary Wayne Thomas originated. She confirmed that Thomas was indeed a real person, and he was living off the interest of a trust fund worth more than $1 million. His account was still active, and money was being withdrawn regularly. But over the past year, he communicated solely through letters and rare phone calls. Looking for answers, Greenville police contacted Thomas's family. His father confirmed that he had set up the trust fund for his son. He said Gary was a troubled young man, who battled drug and alcohol dependency. Worried about his son's well-being, he instructed the family attorney to draw up the trust. He hoped the fund would limit the amount of money Gary could access to purchase drugs and alcohol. But the arrangement had caused friction, and Mr. Thomas had little contact with Gary after that. In fact, he hadn't heard from his son in over a year. The information put investigators no closer to establishing the connection between Gary Wayne Thomas and George Calamaris. They needed to find Thomas. Hoping to track him down, police contacted the apartment manager of his last known address.
She said that Gary Wayne Thomas disappeared sometime around June or the first part of July of 1996. That she thought it to be odd because he left all of his belongings there in the apartment. But one of Gary's friends, she referred to him as George Calamaris, told her that Gary was away in Maryland.
Police had established that George Calamaris and Gary Wayne Thomas had lived in the same apartment complex in North Carolina and were friends. Now, the wealthy Gary Wayne Thomas was missing. The information was passed on to the Maryland detectives. Police now feared that Gary Wayne Thomas had met the same fate as Thomas Wayne Jones in Delaware, that he had been murdered in an attempt to get at his money. But they had no proof that anything had actually happened to Gary Wayne Thomas. In fact, money was still being withdrawn from Thomas's account through a bank in Silver Spring, Maryland. But it couldn't be Calamaris making the withdrawals. He was in prison.
Well, we asked the bank to please keep the account open. Don't close it. Allow the withdrawals to continue so we could start tracing them. And when we did that, we immediately, from the codes, from the transaction codes, we could find out what bank the money was being withdrawn from in Maryland, obtained the bank film, and the first film we obtained, the person obtaining the money was Noreen Calamaris, George's wife.
Noreen Calamaris, who had been cooperative since early in the investigation, was arrested for bank fraud and money laundering. A subsequent search of the Calamaris home uncovered Gary Wayne Thomas's ATM card and some unmailed letters allegedly signed by him asking his bank to increase his monthly allowance. Noreen told police that after her husband was arrested, their friend at the machine shop started bringing over Thomas's mail. It included bank statements, the ATM card, and blank checks. She said that her husband told her that Thomas had given them permission to use the items. Noreen hadn't seen or heard from Thomas since she left North Carolina with George Calamaris several months earlier. The information prompted investigators to search Calamaris's jail cell. Several typewritten letters ready to be mailed to the bank in North Carolina, signed Gary Wayne Thomas, were confiscated. Because the U.S. mail was being used to perpetuate the crimes, the evidence was forwarded to the U.S. Postal Inspection Service Crime Lab in New York. There, forensic sciences manager John Schatz compared handwriting from the documents found in Calamaris's house and jail cell against known samples of Gary Wayne Thomas.
We know that we never write exactly the same way. If we have writings that is exactly the same, it's usually an indication that it is a trace forgery or another type of photocopy that has been reproduced and the document has been altered. But in many cases, what we do is we compare the idiosyncratic movement, we make a comparison of the similar motions and dissimilar motions, and then we become a determination if they're written by the same author.
Besides the shape and slant of the letters, analysts also look for the pressure on the page and places where a forger paused to consciously form his letters a certain way. These pen lifts can be a tip-off to a forgery.
When we made those comparisons, we were able to determine that Mr. Calamaris was the author of the Gary Thomas signatures on the typewritten letters.
Unable to dodge the evidence, Calamaris knew his run was over. To avoid the death penalty, he confessed to his crimes. He told investigators that he had been friends with Gary Wayne Thomas, but soon became jealous of his wealth. He plotted to kill him and take over his life, or at least his trust fund. In July 1996, Calamaris offered to show Thomas some marijuana plants he said he was growing in a field near the apartments. But when they drove out there, Calamaris shot Thomas dead. He left him in the woods, then later returned to scatter the remains so they would never be found. The crime went undetected for almost 3 years. Financially, it had worked out well for Calamaris, but it wasn't enough. Soon after returning to Maryland, he began devising another scheme. He would kill his friend, Thomas Wayne Jones, assume his identity, and cash in on his victim's wealth. The plan backfired, however, when Jones lived long enough to identify his attacker. For his crimes, George Calamaris received 395 years for the federal crime of bank fraud, life in prison for the murder of Thomas Wayne Jones, and 45 years for the murder of Gary Wayne Thomas. Noreen Calamaris received 6 months of house arrest for money laundering and mail fraud. For some murderers, taking a life is not enough. They want to become their victims. The result is an ongoing deception that's difficult to maintain. Each day increases the chances that a killer will be exposed, hiding behind a stolen identity. In North Carolina, a tragic car accident is blamed for the death of a 45-year-old woman. But a routine investigation raises more questions than answers. And police soon learn that things aren't always as they appear to be. A mother of 6 is found brutally murdered in her Florida home. The forensic evidence points detectives to a suspect, but his whereabouts and the motive behind the murder remain a mystery. For some killers, murder can be a profitable business. And when a victim has been targeted for death, homicide investigators must look beyond the obvious to uncover a murder for hire. On the morning of August 23, 1995, a motorist summoned rescue workers and emergency personnel to a remote area off North Carolina's Blue Ridge Parkway. While pulled over at a scenic overlook, she had spotted a van that had plunged several hundred feet down the steep embankment. There was no movement in the vehicle. Transylvania County rescue workers made their way down the cliff, hopeful they would find survivors. When the rescue worker entered the vehicle, a piece of cinder block stained with blood fell out of the van. A woman laid slumped across the front seat. She had suffered massive head injuries. There was no pulse. The body was removed from the vehicle and sent to the morgue for examination. North Carolina State Police began looking for clues to tell them how and why the vehicle went off the road.
I didn't see no skid marks with no plan.
No skid marks or any signs of sudden braking were found. And there were no indications that the driver had swerved off the road. It was likely that the woman had fallen asleep at the wheel or had been under the influence of drugs or alcohol. The van was brought up the embankment for a more detailed evaluation. A check on the vehicle's tags revealed that the van was registered to a man named Edward Kratzert, whose address was several hundred miles away in Bradenton, Florida. After finding no obvious mechanical problems with the van, technicians processed the vehicle. Reddish-brown stains were found on the exterior of the driver's side door. They tested positive for human blood. Inside, they recovered a wallet and driver's license. The driver was identified as 45-year-old Wendy Kratzert, the wife of the vehicle's owner. Blood was found throughout the van. The back of an earring was located on the passenger seat floor. Unsure what to make of the findings, investigators collected several items into evidence. Transylvania County authorities began trying to track down the victim's family to inform them of Wendy's tragic death. At autopsy, medical examiner Dr. Robert Thompson looked to the victim for clues that could explain the crash. He found no traces of drugs or alcohol in the victim's blood or tissue. Wendy's death had resulted from blunt force injuries to the head. She had suffered 5 individual fractures to the top and back of her skull. Though Wendy had not been wearing a seatbelt, for Dr. Thompson, the location and number of injuries were not typical of car crash victims.
Usually injuries that we find with automobile accidents are those in the face areas where the face comes down and hits the dashboard. So the injuries that are found are not really consistent with an automobile accident, although conceivably it could have happened that way.
The autopsy results prompted investigators from the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation to take a closer look at Wendy Kratzert's accident. Special agent and blood spatter expert Andy Klein reviewed photographs taken at the scene. He was immediately struck by the lack of blood found where the victim's body came to rest.
From the position that she came to rest in with her head in the passenger side floorboard, and with the wound being to the top and the back of her head, I would have expected to see a larger pool of blood in that floorboard had she received that wound in the van.
More troubling, however, was the presence of the victim's blood on the vehicle's exterior running board.
There was several blood spatters that I noted on the running board portion of the vehicle that would have been protected had the door been shut. So at some point the door was open and she bled on it.
All of the evidence suggested that Wendy Kratzert had been bleeding before she ever got into the van. The routine death investigation had raised more questions than answers. Police learned that Wendy and her husband owned a vacation home a few miles away from the scene of the accident. Later that night, authorities went to the address. No one appeared to be home. Then, they discovered a large pool of blood. Tests later confirmed it had come from Wendy Kratzert. An earring back, identical to the one found inside the van, was located a few inches away. Technicians concluded that no one could have survived such blood loss without immediate medical attention. Nearby, investigators found the outline of an object. Its shape was similar to the blood-stained cinder block found inside the van. For police, there could be no doubt that Wendy Kratzert had been brutally murdered. Her death had been staged to appear as an accident. After obtaining a warrant, the team made their way into the residence, unsure of what or who they might find. No one was home, and the residence showed no signs of forced entry or ransacking. Investigators thoroughly photographed the scene. They also collected numerous personal items and papers that belonged to the victim. Now, investigators had to determine who had killed Wendy and why. Transylvania County Police were eager to question Wendy's husband, Ed. He was tracked down to his home in Bradenton, Florida. Police there were contacted and asked to speak to the victim's husband. Ed Kratzert couldn't believe his wife had been murdered. He stated that since the couple's children graduated from high school, Wendy had been spending a lot of time at their vacation home in North Carolina. Ed explained that he had recently suffered a heart attack and was at home at the time of the murder. Wendy had helped nurse him back to health. And soon after, she decided to return to North Carolina by herself. Wendy enjoyed her independence. She had even taken a part-time job as a waitress in North Carolina.
Like I said, I don't want to push anything too early right now.
Ed couldn't think of anyone who might want to harm her. Florida police confirmed Ed's alibi, and soon after, he was cleared as a suspect. Police and forensic examiners had exposed a tragic car accident as an elaborate attempt to conceal a brutal crime. But with few leads and no obvious suspects, it appeared that Wendy Kratzert's killer might get away with murder. In Transylvania County, North Carolina, a routine traffic death investigation had exposed a brutal homicide. 45-year-old Wendy Kratzert had been savagely beaten to death. Her body placed in a van, which was then pushed over a steep cliff. Frustrated by the lack of suspects or an obvious motive, police in Wendy's hometown of Bradenton, Florida, questioned the victim's friends and neighbors. One close friend told police she could think of only one person who might want to harm Wendy, and that was her husband, Ed Kratzert. Wendy had described him as ruthlessly controlling. He watched over her every move and was extremely critical of her behavior. Wendy said he could also be physically abusive. Things had become even more strained after Ed's heart attack. The medical bills had left the couple in severe financial trouble. Just before her death, Wendy had talked about leaving her husband. The findings were passed on to police in North Carolina, where Wendy's murder took place. Following up on the information, investigators learned that Ed Kratzert stood to gain $100,000 from Wendy's death. But so far, he had made no attempts to collect on his wife's insurance policy. Though Ed had misrepresented his relationship with Wendy, he had a solid alibi, and there was no motive connecting him to the crime. Desperate to identify Wendy's killer, detectives questioned her co-workers at the local restaurant where she worked part-time. One recalled that just before her death, Wendy had been tired and irritable. She said she had been dealing with unexpected house guests who had shown up from Florida on a few occasions. The co-worker didn't know the name of the visitors, but it was clear to Transylvania homicide detective Rita Smith that Wendy was not happy to have them in her house.
Wendy had been very uncomfortable with these people, that they had smoked in her house, that she felt that they had pilfered through her belongings.
Looking to identify the house guests, investigators scoured through the items collected from Wendy's vacation home. They found a potential clue. The names Tom and Luana Harrison had been handwritten on Wendy's calendar. And a records check revealed that the Harrisons lived in the same Bradenton, Florida neighborhood as Wendy and her husband. Florida police were dispatched to the Harrisons' home to question the couple. They admitted having visited Wendy in North Carolina a few weeks prior to her death. Tom explained that he and Luana were close friends of the Kratzerts. They spent a lot of time with the couple. They hadn't noticed any problems between Ed and Wendy. Wendy invited them to come stay at their North Carolina home whenever they wanted. She even gave them a key to the house. They took her up on the offer. But that was weeks before her murder. They hadn't been back since. As a matter of routine, the officer asked the couple their whereabouts at the time of Wendy's murder. Tom Harrison suddenly became agitated. He felt he was being treated like a suspect. He ended the interview and asked the officer to leave. Tom Harrison's odd behavior led police to believe he was hiding something.
This timeline here.
To find out what, they subpoenaed his credit card statements for the weeks surrounding the murder. They found that numerous charges had been made to hotels and car rental agencies throughout North Carolina. In fact, the receipts put Tom and Luana Harrison near the scene of the crime in the days before and just after the murder. Tom Harrison had been caught in a lie. Though police could find no motive, the circumstantial evidence was pointing to the Harrisons as Wendy Kratzert's killers. Agents from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement were contacted. They were asked to take Tom Harrison and his wife Luana into custody. As FDLE Special Agent Vince Delacchio prepared to put his team together, he received some startling news. Tom Harrison was dead.
I'd come in the morning and received a phone call from the Manatee County Sheriff's Office. The investigator there asked me if I had seen the front page of the morning paper. The front headline was, "Local man dies in boating accident."
According to reports, authorities had discovered Tom Harrison's boat burning out of control in the Gulf of Mexico. After putting out the blaze, rescue workers began a massive search to find the owner. For several days, efforts to find Tom Harrison turned up nothing. Soon after, the search was called off. The prime suspect in Wendy Kratzert's homicide was missing and presumed dead. Authorities in North Carolina believed they had finally identified the killer of 45-year-old Wendy Kratzert, whose brutal murder had been staged to look like a car accident. But as they prepared to make the arrest, they learned that their prime suspect was missing and presumed dead after his boat was found burning in the Gulf of Mexico. But authorities were convinced that Tom Harrison had staged his own death in an attempt to throw investigators off his trail. Lieutenant Marty Redmond of the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission was asked to find out.
When I got to the scene and looked at the boat, I saw a vessel approximately 25 feet long that used to be a cabin-type boat. The boat had burned completely to the waterline, excepting certain portions of the starboard bow and the starboard quarter.
Fire marshals were able to quickly rule out electrical problems as the source of the blaze. After carefully analyzing the burnt remains, investigators found that some places on the boat had burned at a much higher temperature than others. And wood marred with deep, scaly scars, referred to as alligator patterns, was found next to wood that was nearly untouched by the fire. There was only one explanation for the uneven burn patterns.
The fire marshal's office determined that the fire was started with an accelerant and where in the boat that it was started by indicators from burn patterns, different melting points of certain materials, and other items that they are skilled in looking for in charred ashes or charred remains of fires.
The fire had been intentionally set.
Well, Lieutenant.
And having found no traces of human remains among the debris, investigators were certain that Tom Harrison had set it. Lieutenant Redmond questioned Tom Harrison's wife, Luana. Careful not to reveal that examiners had exposed arson, he asked her about the circumstances surrounding her husband's mysterious death.
We can't close this case out right now.
She claimed that on the night of the fire, Tom hadn't been feeling well. After watching a late-night football game, he told her he wanted to go fishing. Concerned for his health, she tried to stop him. But there was little she could do. Tom packed up his fishing gear and left a short while later. For investigators, Luana did not appear to be the grieving widow who had just lost her husband of more than 20 years. Her only concerns were with quickly closing the investigation into Tom's death. Police soon learned why. In addition to being suspects in Wendy Kratzert's homicide, the Harrisons were in deep financial trouble. And Luana stood to collect a large life insurance settlement as a result of Tom's death. Florida Department of Law Enforcement Special Agent Vince Delacchio.
But I knew at that point in time that Thomas Harrison was not dead, and that this boating accident was more than likely a staged event, just to hide from the fact that he was a suspect in that case, and probably more than likely in knowing his situation that he was looking for some insurance money.
To test the theory, authorities put 24-hour surveillance on the Harrisons' Bradenton, Florida home. Months passed without a break. But then, police spotted Tom Harrison alive and well. And it appeared that he and Luana were preparing to leave town. Shortly after the couple hit the road, police pulled them over. Tom Harrison gave the officer a fake name and driver's license. He and Luana were placed under arrest and charged with insurance fraud and arson. But Tom Harrison was uncooperative, and with no hard evidence tying him to the homicide, investigators were still a long way from proving that he had murdered Wendy Kratzert. For police, the Harrisons' close ties with the victim's husband could no longer be ignored. Investigators began to theorize that Ed Kratzert, unhappy in his marriage to Wendy, had hired the Harrisons to kill her.
The time was right to recontact Ed Kratzert, the husband of the victim, and attempt to conduct another interview. With the fact that Harrison had been arrested, we felt as though that would open up the dialogue with Mr. Kratzert.
Kratzert was brought in for questioning and informed of Harrison's arrest. Investigators confronted him with their murder-for-hire theory and insinuated they had evidence to back it up. It was a bluff, but it worked.
Well, he said to me...
Ed Kratzert decided to talk.
I didn't know what he meant by
He confessed to taking part in the plot to murder his wife.
He can not only make it...
He insisted it wasn't his idea. Kratzert said that he was complaining to the Harrisons about his marriage. He knew Wendy was planning to leave him.
No.
After his heart attack, he was dreading the idea of a prolonged divorce and separation of assets. Tom Harrison told him he could make his problem go away for a fee. Ed agreed. The death was supposed to look like an accident.
Done deal. And he said
When it was exposed as a murder, Ed refused to collect on his wife's life insurance policy.
make it look like an accident.
The Harrisons were never paid for the job. As a result, Ed feared that Tom Harrison was plotting to kill him. Ed Kratzert was placed under arrest and charged with conspiracy to commit murder. Police confronted Tom Harrison with the statements. He refused to cooperate. But it made no difference. The credit card receipts that put him near the crime scene at the time of the murder, coupled with Ed Kratzert's confession, was all police needed to charge him with the homicide. Police believe that after showing up unexpectedly at Wendy's North Carolina vacation home, Tom Harrison bludgeoned the unsuspecting woman to death. After the kill, the couple loaded Wendy's body into her van and drove to a remote spot along the Blue Ridge Parkway, where they then attempted to stage her death as a car accident. Ed Kratzert was found guilty of the first-degree murder of his wife and received a sentence of no less than 11 years. Tom Harrison was sentenced to 20 years. In exchange for her testimony, Luana Harrison received 3 years probation. The Harrisons had tried to get away with murder by staging an elaborate accident. But in 1995, in the suburbs of Sarasota, Florida, one killer made no attempt to cover up his actions. On the afternoon of November 7th, 13-year-old Stevie Bellish returned home from school. No one appeared to be home. But then she stumbled upon a horrifying scene. Her mother, 35-year-old Sheila Bellish, lay dead on the kitchen floor. Panicked, the young girl called 911. Deputies and forensic technicians from the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office were immediately dispatched to the home. To prevent any contamination, a single forensic technician was allowed to enter the residence and document the scene. Sheila Bellish had been brutally murdered. She had suffered a single gunshot wound to the cheek. There were also indications that she had been viciously beaten. Her throat was so deeply cut, she was almost decapitated. As technicians began processing the crime scene, the victim's husband, Jamie Bellish, arrived home. Detectives broke the news. Police assured him that his stepdaughter, Stevie, and the couple's newly born quadruplets were all safe and unharmed. The frantic husband was escorted away from the house and taken to the police station to answer questions. Technicians looked to the blood evidence to help them piece together the events that transpired inside the house. Based on the size and location of blood spatter patterns, they determined that Sheila Bellish was initially shot near a door that led to the laundry room. Streaks of blood suggested she then attempted to crawl away from her attacker. But she was only able to get a few feet away before her killer caught up with her and slashed her throat. There was nothing to suggest that robbery was the motive. In the laundry room adjacent to the kitchen, technicians located a single .45 caliber shell casing. A few feet away lay a white towel. Some of the fabric was covered with gunshot residue, suggesting it had been used as a makeshift silencer. But for some reason, the killer only got off one shot before using a knife to finish the job. Evidence technician Lisa Lanham tried to make sense of the excessive violence inflicted on Sheila Bellish.
There are two possibilities of why he abandoned the gun. One is that the gun is very loud in a small confined area and probably sounds even louder when you're the one shooting it, and he may have feared that the neighbors would overhear the weapon. The other possibility is that the towel got caught in the gun and then basically made the gun inoperable.
Looking for any trace of the killer that may have been left behind, technicians collected dozens of prints from throughout the residence, including some found inches from the bullet casing. All of the evidence was forwarded to the Sarasota County Crime Lab. Homicide detective Chris Iorio was assigned lead detective on the case.
All I knew at that point was we did have a mother of 6 kids deceased in the kitchen, head trauma, most likely gunshot was involved, and we took it from there.
Investigators know from experience that their best opportunity to solve a murder falls within the first 24 hours. With few clues and no obvious suspects, they hoped an autopsy could point them to this brutal killer. Police in Sarasota, Florida struggled to find answers in the death of 35-year-old Sheila Bellish, a mother of 6 found brutally murdered in her home. At autopsy, the medical examiner recovered a .45 caliber bullet that had been fired from close range into the victim's face. It had shattered her jaw but it was not the cause of death. A single knife wound had severed the victim's left and right jugular veins. Sheila Bellish had bled to death. There were no signs of sexual assault, and no clues to the killer's identity were found. The overkill observed at the crime scene led police to suspect that the killer was someone close to the victim. Sheila's husband, Jamie Bellish, was brought in to answer questions. He described Sheila as a dedicated mother and a loving wife. Jamie explained that he and Sheila and her 2 children from a previous marriage had recently moved to Florida from San Antonio, Texas. Sheila had just been through a nasty divorce. And when she and her new husband learned they were going to have quadruplets, they decided to start their lives over in a new city. The decision to move had not been an easy one. But according to Jamie, Sheila's ex-husband continued harassing her, even after the divorce was finalized. Jamie said that at the time of the murder, he was at work. But homicide detective Chris Iorio was taking nothing for granted.
At the beginning of the case, Jamie Bellish was our obvious suspect due to just his role in the family structure, but within, I'd say, 4 or 5 hours after we responded, we felt pretty sure that he was not involved.
Detective Iorio contacted authorities in San Antonio, Texas, and asked them to speak with Sheila's ex-husband about the murder.
Okay, how about...
Well, sure, I keep all my records. Would you like to see them?
Alan Blackthorne, a wealthy businessman, admitted that his divorce from Sheila had been bitter. But he insisted he never would have harmed the mother of his children. At the time of the murder, he was on a golfing trip in Arizona, and he had the receipts and documents to prove it.
And did anybody travel with you on this flight?
With no suspects and no obvious motive for the killing, Sarasota police turned to the physical evidence for clues. Examiners found a fingerprint that did not match any of the Bellish family members, and it had been found just inches away from the spent bullet casing. The evidence put investigators one step closer to identifying Sheila's killer. Now they needed to find out who had left that print. Detectives returned to the Bellish neighborhood to question residents about the day of the murder. One recalled seeing a Hispanic man dressed in military camouflage getting out of a white car and walking through the neighborhood. The neighbor didn't get a good look at the man's face, but was able to recall a few numbers from the license plate.
When we heard about a Hispanic male walking through the neighborhood in camouflage, we knew that most likely he didn't belong to that neighborhood. It was mostly a retirement community, and nobody wears camouflage in this heat. And evidently it was a long-sleeve shirt, long pants, and that just stood out.
A description of the man and details of the homicide were released through area newspapers. A short while later, police got a tip. A clerk who worked at a convenience store a few miles from the crime scene told police that he also saw the Hispanic man dressed in camouflage around the time of Sheila's murder.
I showed him some directions on the map.
The man had come in looking for directions. In fact, he was trying to locate the neighborhood where the young mother was found murdered.
Make your first left and the next right.
The clerk handed the man his laminated map of the area. He added that the stranger got into a white car and drove off. Officers collected the laminated map, hopeful the suspect had left his prints behind. At the crime lab, examiners located several prints on the map. Evidence technician Lisa Lanham then compared them to the suspect's prints that were recovered from the crime scene. She found a match. Police had identified a suspect and had evidence that could tie him to the crime scene. Now they needed to know his name. All they had was a partial license plate number from his vehicle. It wasn't much to go on.
We initially ran a tag out of Florida. I mean, a lead's a lead, you have to try. And it came back to nothing. And then we decided, since the Bellishes were from Texas, that'd be the next state to try. And when we got that tag, the information back, it was registered to somebody in Texas, so we had to follow up that lead.
Investigators traced the white vehicle to a 21-year-old Austin, Texas resident named Jose Joey Del Toro.
We ran a background check on Jose Del Toro. As soon as we got his name, we did find out that he had a criminal history, but nothing that would make you believe he was a murderer.
But that was a conclusion forensic scientists would have to make. Joey Del Toro's fingerprint card was forwarded to the Sarasota County Crime Lab. There, examiners compared his prints to those recovered from the Bellish home. After careful scrutiny, they concluded that Joey Del Toro had left the print. A warrant was issued for his arrest. Police in Del Toro's hometown of Austin, Texas, were unable to track down the suspect. However, they did manage to locate his white vehicle. Armed with a warrant, investigators processed the car. Inside a bag, they collected a Colt .45 caliber semi-automatic handgun. It was the same type of weapon used to shoot Sheila Bellish. To nail their case against Joey Del Toro, investigators forwarded the weapon to ballistics experts at the Florida Department of Law Enforcement Crime Lab. First, the weapon was fired into a water tank. The water slows the bullet's flight without distorting the unique marks left behind as it passes through the gun barrel. The rounds collected from the water tank could then be compared to the bullet recovered from Sheila Bellish's cheek. Under a comparison microscope, examiners found that the striation marks that are unique to each gun were identical on both bullets. All of the forensic analysis left investigators with no doubt that Joey Del Toro had murdered the young mother of 6. But having found no obvious connection between the killer and the victim, the motive behind the savage slaying was as mysterious as the killer's whereabouts. Police in Sarasota, Florida, had finally linked a suspect to the murder of 35-year-old mother of 6, Sheila Bellish, found brutally beaten, shot, and stabbed in her home. All of the evidence suggested that 21-year-old Joey Del Toro committed the murder and then fled to Texas. But so far, all efforts to locate him had gone unsuccessful. Then, police got a tip that the fugitive was staying with relatives in San Antonio. For help, Florida police contacted the Texas Rangers stationed there. But authorities there had no luck finding the suspect.
Hey, how's it going today?
However, they managed to track down his cousin, a man named Sammy Gonzalez. He agreed to come in and answer questions. Texas Rangers Lieutenant Gary De Los Santos conducted the interview. Sammy Gonzalez claimed he had no idea where his cousin Joey Del Toro might be. But he believed he had information about the murder. He said that a few months back, an acquaintance of his, a golf hustler named Danny Rocha, had tried to hire him to beat somebody up. Sammy was interested in the job, but when he saw the intended victim, he declined. But he knew someone else who might be interested in the job.
Sammy admitted to us that he was approached by Danny Rocha and was asked to beat up a girl. Once Sammy realized it was a woman, he refused to do it, but he brought up to Joey, his cousin Joey Del Toro, that maybe he would be willing to do it.
Sammy claimed that he didn't know if his cousin had taken the job, and he didn't ask why the woman had been targeted. Unsure what to make of the information, investigators began digging into the golf hustler's background. They were surprised by what they found. Danny Rocha was a close associate of Sheila Bellish's wealthy ex-husband. Suddenly, investigators had to consider that they had exposed a murder-for-hire scheme. Police knew that Sheila's divorce had been bitter. But had it led to murder? One friend who knew the couple well thought so. Sheila had described her ex-husband, Alan Blackthorne, as obsessive and controlling. During their divorce, he had demanded that Sheila sign over custody of their children. When she refused, Blackthorne had her falsely arrested for child abuse. The charges were ultimately dismissed, and Sheila was awarded custody of the children. Alan Blackthorne allegedly said that he would get even. According to the friend, Sheila took the threat seriously. When Sheila and her new family moved to Florida, they kept an unlisted phone number and took pains to keep their new address a secret. Now, investigators looked for proof that the victim's ex-husband had orchestrated her murder. Danny Rocha, the person police believe had hired the hitman, was brought in for questioning. Under advice of his attorney, he refused to answer any questions. Before letting him go, however, Lieutenant De Los Santos asked Rocha to pose for a photograph with him. He agreed. The following day, Sammy Gonzalez was brought in for another interview. Police were convinced he knew more about the murder plot than he claimed. When shown the photograph, Sammy became convinced that Danny Rocha was cooperating with authorities. Fearing he had been implicated in the murder, he decided to talk. Now, he admitted that he had accepted $14,000 from Danny Rocha to murder Sheila Bellish. A short while later, he hired his cousin to actually carry out the homicide. Sammy believed that Sheila Bellish's ex-husband, Alan Blackthorne, had ordered and financed the murder. He also told investigators where they could find the hitman, Joey Del Toro. Soon after, Del Toro was tracked down to a motel in Mexico. He was placed under arrest and, after extensive legal wrangling, extradited back to the United States to stand trial for murder. Authorities had now exposed 3 conspirators in the murder of Sheila Bellish. But the alleged mastermind, Alan Blackthorne, was still a free man. Looking to find evidence linking him to the murder, investigators subpoenaed his phone records for the months prior to the homicide. One number that continually popped up was traced to the bail bondsman who had helped Sheila get out of jail when she was falsely arrested. The bondsman said he recorded all of his phone conversations. Police realized that he would have been one of the few people to have a record of Sheila Bellish's most current address.
Once we got those recordings, that's when you hear Alan Blackthorne, and there's a person calling in pretending to be somebody else and trying to ascertain Sheila's address.
Investigators confirmed that just before the murder, Allen successfully located Sheila's Florida address. The evidence, along with the testimony of the other conspirators, was enough to arrest the wealthy businessman.
Real well by now.
On January 4th, 2000, Allen Blackthorne was taken into custody and charged with conspiracy to commit murder. At trial, police learned that soon after his divorce from Sheila, Allen Blackthorne began plotting to kill her. While on a golfing trip, Blackthorne told his associate, Danny Rocha, that his ex-wife was an abusive mother and he wanted it stopped, even if it meant killing her. Danny Rocha agreed to set it up. After acquiring Sheila's address in Florida, the hitman drove from Texas to the Bellish home. Joey Del Toro broke into the residence and waited for his opportunity. He caught the unsuspecting mother completely off guard. For their role in the murder, Joey Del Toro and Danny Rocha each received life sentences. Sammy Gonzalez was sentenced to 19 years. Allen Blackthorne was found guilty of orchestrating his wife's death and sentenced to life in prison. For some, money is motive enough to commit murder. When there are no obvious connections between killer and victim, detectives turn to forensic examiners to expose the mastermind behind a murder for hire.